The dining room glowed with the kind of cold opulence only money could buy. Chicago's skyline stretched endlessly through the penthouse windows, each light outside flickering with life, while the air inside felt suffocating with silence. Richard Thompson loosened his silk tie and dropped a stack of merger documents onto the polished mahogany table. His eyes, sharp and calculating like a courtroom strategist, did not meet his wife's. 5 years, Emily, he said at last, his voice flat but edged with impatience. 5 years of trying. Across from him, Emily steadied her breath. She had learned how to handle heated debates in lecture halls, had trained students to challenge constitutional precedents with logic and evidence, but nothing prepared her for this, her marriage being dismantled over dinner. "You make it sound like a contract," she replied softly, though her voice trembled. "We need more tests. The doctor said both of us should." Richard's hand slammed against the table. Crystal glasses rattled dangerously close to spilling. "I don't need any tests. Every man in my family has children. My father had 3, my grandfather had 5, my younger sister already has 2. He leaned back, adjusting his Italian suit as if the matter were already settled. "The problem isn't with me." Emily's heart pounded. She wanted to shout, to shake him, but instead she drew in the calm that had always defined her in the classroom. "Richard, where's your logic? You're one of the best attorneys in this city. You can't just dismiss evidence because it doesn't suit you." He laughed without humor. "Logic is simple. I'm wasting time. Do you know what the firm is worth today? 50 million. And who am I supposed to leave it all to? Empty rooms? You can't give me what I need." Her eyes blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "So this is all about an heir, not love, not us." Ross. Chard stood, his shadow tall against the glittering skyline. "I'll have the papers sent over tomorrow. You can keep the condo if you like, it's better this way." His phone buzzed, and without hesitation he answered, his tone instantly shifting into polished professionalism. "Mr. Daniels, yes, about that merger. Of course, we can resolve this now." Emily studied him as he spoke, the man she had met in law school when they were 2 hungry dreamers, now entirely consumed by ambition. When he hung up, he didn't even glance her way before collecting his briefcase. At the door, he paused briefly. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. You're young, beautiful, intelligent. You can have an incredible life, just not with me. You can't give me what I need." The door shut. The silence that followed was heavier than his words. Emily rose slowly and crossed the room to the wall where their wedding photo hung. In it, she wore a simple dress, he a sharp suit, 2 young faces full of hope. Her hand lingered on the glass before she pulled it down and placed it face first in a drawer. "Genetics," she whispered bitterly. "We'll see who's right, Richard." The next morning, a thick envelope arrived. Divorce papers delivered by courier with brutal efficiency. His side of the closet was already empty. Emily sat at her vanity, staring at the documents, grief and fury battling within her. Finally, she reached for the card her gynecologist had given her months ago. Dr. Chen's number stared up at her. Hours later, she sat in the doctor's quiet office, her hands clasped so tightly they hurt. Dr. Chen laid out the test results with professional calm. "Emily, everything is normal. Your hormone levels are strong. Your ovarian reserve is excellent. There is no medical reason you cannot conceive." Emily blinked back tears. Relief mingled with devastation. "So it wasn't me?" The doctor nodded. "Infertility can never be fully diagnosed without both partners. Statistically, in nearly half of cases, the male factor is significant." Her chest constricted. He had refused the tests. He had walked away convinced of her failure, blind to his own. She gathered the papers in trembling hands, a strange sense of vindication rising through her sorrow. Richard had been wrong, but it no longer mattered. That night, back in her empty apartment, Emily sat at her desk, laptop glowing in the dark. She opened the fertility clinic's secure portal. A list of donor profiles appeared, numbers, statistics, carefully curated traits. She scrolled past faces she would never see, stories she would never know. Her cursor hovered over one profile, donor 8742. Tall, dark hair, blue eyes, Ivy League education, the faintest echo of Richard. Her finger trembled on the mouse. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about her future, her choice, her family. With a deep breath, she clicked. Under the sterile glow of the clinic lights, Emily felt her heart hammering like a drum inside her chest. She had prepared herself for months for this moment, the quiet decision to step into motherhood alone, without Richard, without anyone's permission but her own. The nurse's voice was calm, rehearsed. "We're ready, Professor Jenkins. Are you sure you'd like to proceed?" Emily nodded, her throat too tight for words. A decade earlier, she might have imagined this room filled with her husband's nervous energy, his hand wrapped around hers, their laughter to hide the fear. Now there was only silence and the low hum of machines. Yet that silence carried something new: control, agency, a future that belonged to her. The insemination itself took only minutes, a clinical procedure that seemed almost anticlimactic given Triplets. He waited carried, but when Emily walked out into the sharp March air, it felt as though she had crossed an invisible line. She wasn't just Emily Jenkins, law professor, department chair, divorcee. She was a woman who had declared her own right to create life. 2 weeks later, she sat in her apartment, hands trembling as she stared at the test strip. Positive. The word lit her up like fire. She laughed, she cried, she pressed her palm against her flat belly, whispering, "Hello, little one." She told Olivia first, who screamed with joy down the phone. "You're really doing this, Em. You're going to be a mom." But fate had not finished rewriting her story. At her 8-week ultrasound, Dr. Williams moved the wand across her abdomen, eyes narrowing. "Well now," the doctor murmured. Emily's heart lurched. "Is something wrong?" "No," the doctor said slowly, a smile tugging at her lips. "Something extraordinary. Look here." Emily turned to the monitor, her breath catching. Not one, not two, but 3 small sacs pulsed on the screen. 3 tiny heartbeats flickered like stars in the dark. Triplets? The word felt foreign, impossible. Her vision blurred as fear and awe crashed through her. One child had seemed daunting enough. 3 at once felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into a vast, unknown future. The doctor placed a steady hand on her arm. "They're all healthy, strong, but it will be a demanding pregnancy, Emily. You'll need support." That night, Emily sat on her balcony with the city lights flickering beneath her. The donor profile replayed in her mind. Donor 8742, traits eerily close to Richard's. 3 children who might carry his echoes without ever knowing him. A chill crept down her spine. Would people see them and see him? Would she? And yet, when she closed her eyes, she didn't see Richard. She saw 3 children chasing each other through a sunlit park, their laughter tangled in the breeze. She saw birthday cakes with 3 sets of candles, tiny shoes lined at the door, 3 voices calling her Mom. The news spread carefully, cautiously. Olivia promised to help. Colleagues congratulated her with cautious surprise. And then there was Nathan Miller. She had met him only weeks earlier, a visiting professor speaking on medical ethics. His calm intelligence and quiet kindness had caught her off guard. When she confessed to him, almost by accident, that she was considering single motherhood, he hadn't flinched. He had simply said, "Children need love, not a perfect formula. If you're ready to give them that, you're already a mother." Now, as her belly grew and the reality of triplets loomed, Nathan became more than a colleague. He was the one who carried her books when the weight grew too much, who drove her to appointments, who brought food when exhaustion left her faint. He never overstepped, never presumed. He was simply there, steady as a lighthouse against the storm. The pregnancy was grueling, nausea that came in waves, bed rest weeks earlier than expected, constant monitoring. There were nights Emily wept into her pillow, terrified she couldn't do it, that she had made a reckless choice. But every morning she placed her hand on her stomach and whispered, "I chose you. I will not fail you." When the day finally came, the delivery room was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices. Hours of labor pushed her beyond exhaustion until, at last, 3 tiny cries rose one after another. 2 boys and a girl. They were small, fragile, each weighing barely 5 pounds, but they were here. "Alexander," she whispered to the first, "Benjamin," to the second, and finally to the girl, Charlotte. As the nurse, bustled around them, Emily gathered all 3 into her trembling arms, tears streaming freely now. For a moment, the world disappeared. There was only the warmth of 3 miraculous lives pressed against her, 3 heartbeats that answered the one inside her chest. When Nathan appeared in the doorway with flowers and eyes shining suspiciously bright, Emily realized something else. She wasn't as alone as she had feared. And in that fragile, overwhelming moment, she knew the empire Richard had sacrificed her for meant nothing, because here, swaddled in her arms, were 3 futures more valuable than all his millions combined. Rain pattered softly against the kitchen window as Emily tried to wrangle 3 lunchboxes at once. 5 years had passed since the night she whispered names into a delivery room full of tears and chaos, and somehow those helpless newborns had transformed into whirlwinds of personality. Alexander, precise and solemn, was carefully packing his science project, a cardboard solar system, each planet painstakingly painted. Benjamin was climbing on a chair, cereal bowl in one hand, shoe half-tied on the wrong foot. Charlotte sat serenely at the table, coloring a family portrait with a seriousness that belonged on a courtroom bench. "Everyone has 10 minutes?" Emily called, glancing at the clock. "Shoes, coats, homework, and no, Ben, dinosaurs don't go in your lunch." The house was messy, loud, alive. Everything the penthouse she once shared with Richard had never been. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, she still wondered at the strange twist of fate. She had walked away with nothing but her name and her freedom, and now she was rich in chaos and love. Nathan was part of that rhythm now. What had begun as shared cups of coffee and cautious companionship had deepened with every sleepless night, every scraped knee, every doctor's appointment. He hadn't just helped, he had stayed. His proposal had come one quiet evening after the children finally slept, and Emily had cried because it wasn't the grand gestures she'd once imagined. It was real, steady, chosen. They married in a small ceremony, the triplets in tiny outfits clinging to their new father's legs. Months later, adoption papers were signed. The family was whole. But life has a cruel way of disguising storms as ordinary days. One spring morning, a decade after the fateful ultrasound that revealed 3 heartbeats, Emily was packing for a conference in New York. She kissed Nathan goodbye at the university gates, laughing when Benjamin shouted, "Bring cookies, not vegetables." She looked radiant at 45, lines at her eyes that told stories of laughter, silver strands that glinted with wisdom. She was happy, whole, content in ways Richard could never have imagined. The flight was short, the taxi ride even shorter. But fate chose that corner, that delivery truck, that one red light. When the phone rang in Nathan's lecture hall, he almost ignored it. 3 times it buzzed before he answered. The voice on the other end was clinical, apologetic, devastating. By the time he boarded the next plane to New York, Emily was already gone. Back in Chicago, the world unraveled. Nathan sat the children down, 3 small bodies perched on the couch, faces expectant and innocent. His voice broke as he told them their mother had been in an accident. Charlotte's cry split the silence. Benjamin shouted, "No!" until his voice cracked, and Alexander stared so hard at the floor it seemed he could burn a hole through it. Nathan pulled them all close, promising through his own sobs, "I will protect you. I will love you enough for both of us." The funeral came too quickly, a blur of flowers and faces and words that couldn't capture her. The chapel filled with students, colleagues, neighbors, each one a testament to Emily's quiet power. At the front, 3 children clung to Nathan's hands, their small frames stiff with grief. And in the last row, a man shifted uncomfortably in his expensive suit. Richard Thompson had told himself he wasn't coming, that there was no point in reopening wounds carved decades ago. But here he was, adjusting his tie as if preparing for court. At 57, he carried the weight of victories that meant nothing in an empty house. His marriages had failed, his line had ended, and the irony of his perfect genetics had long since revealed itself. Yet he had come. Curiosity, guilt, something darker had drawn him. When the family entered, Richard froze. His breath stopped as 3 children walked down the aisle. A boy with his own measured stride, a second with restless energy, a girl whose chin carried Emily's strength, but whose eyes, God help him, were his. Triplets. 10 years old, identical echoes of himself weeping for a woman he once cast aside. The service blurred around him. He barely heard the eulogies, barely felt the prayers. His eyes never left the children. Each tilt of Alexander's head, each flicker of Benjamin's restless grin, each glance from Charlotte's blue eyes felt like a mirror pressed cruelly to his past. When the line of mourners filed forward, Richard found himself moving too. His voice cracked with formality. "I'm sorry for your loss." Nathan nodded politely, pulling the children closer. Alexander stared at him, too steady, too knowing for a child, and in that gaze, Richard felt something collapse inside. He left the chapel shaken, the weight of 10 years crushing him. For the first time in his life, Ard Thompson wasn't thinking about mergers or empires or heirs. He was thinking about 3 children who carried his face, his eyes, his blood, or so he believed. Children who had no idea who he was. That night, while Nathan tucked the triplets into bed, while Charlotte whispered to a photograph of her mother, Richard sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the city lights. His glass of scotch trembled in his hand as one thought grew louder and louder, impossible to silence. "They are mine." The chapel doors closed behind Richard, but the echo of those 3 small voices, thin, trembling, calling "Daddy" to another man, followed him all the way to his car. He sat for a long time behind the wheel, unmoving, the Chicago spring air fogging the windshield. He had told himself he only came for closure. That was the lie he had repeated on the drive over. But closure did not explain why his hands shook now, or why every time he closed his eyes, he saw his own profile carved into the faces of Emily's sons. For days, he couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. His law partners noticed the distraction, whispered about his sudden absences. He brushed them off. In truth, Richard had begun to retrace the timeline, piecing it together with the precision of a litigator unraveling a conspiracy. He and Emily had divorced 15 years earlier. The triplets were 10. It was possible, barely possible, that she had taken something of him before she walked away. A medical sample, a frozen fragment of his legacy, used without his knowledge. It would explain everything. Obsession took root. He dug through fertility statutes, reviewed donor rights cases, even called in favors with colleagues at medical law firms. Each fact he uncovered only sharpened his hunger for answers. At night, he pored over their old marriage documents, her clinic appointments, scraps of evidence that might prove what his gut screamed. They were his. 3 nights after the funeral, Richard finally acted. At 9 p.m., Nathan Miller was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by condolence cards. The triplets were upstairs, finally asleep after another day of asking when their mother was coming back. The doorbell shattered the quiet. He frowned. Too late for neighbors, too early for students lost on campus housing. When he opened the door, he saw a man he recognized instantly. Richard Thompson stood on the porch, flanked by 2 lawyers in sharp suits, their briefcases heavy with papers. His eyes were the same striking blue as Alexander's. "Dr. Miller," Richard said evenly, "we need to speak. It concerns the children." Nathan's grip tightened on the door. "My children are asleep. This isn't the time." "That," Richard said, lowering his voice, "is precisely what we need to discuss, whether they are in fact yours." The words hit like a slap. Nathan stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him to shield the children from the scene. "Whatever you think you know, this is not the way. My family is grieving." "I understand," Richard replied, though his tone suggested anything but. "But the resemblance is undeniable. I believe Emily used my genetic material without consent. If that is true, I have rights." Nathan's voice hardened. "Rights? Where were those rights when she lay awake during endless nights of nausea? When she carried 3 children in her body at risk to her own health? When she wept at 2 a.m. over fevers and nightmares? Where were your rights when they learned to walk, to read, to laugh? You abandoned her because you couldn't face the truth about yourself. Don't you dare stand here and talk about rights." Richard's jaw clenched, but one of his attorneys stepped forward. "Dr. Miller, with respect, DNA doesn't lie. A petition for genetic testing is already being drafted. If Mr. Thompson is their biological father, the law will recognize his claim." Nathan's pulse pounded, but he remained calm. "Then meet me tomorrow. University Medical Center, Department of Medical Ethics, 10 o'clock sharp. Bring your documents. I'll bring mine. And we'll settle this in the light, not on a doorstep where my children sleep." Richard studied him, surprised at the quiet certainty in Nathan's voice. "So you're willing to discuss terms?" "I'm willing," Nathan said, his tone like iron, "to end this conversation before it hurts them more." The next morning, the conference room at the medical center became a battlefield with outraised voices. Richard arrived with 3 attorneys and a folder thick with precedents. Nathan sat alone with 1 slim file, the weight of fatherhood steadier than any legal team. Richard opened with his argument. The timing of the births, the resemblance, the possibility of stolen genetic material. His lawyers pressed forward with statutes, case law, DNA test requests. Nathan listened, then pushed his folder across the table. Inside were certified copies of Lakeside Fertility Clinic documents, donor agreement from 15 years earlier, anonymized selection records, Emily's signed consents. She chose an anonymous donor, number 8742. He signed away all rights, forever, legally binding, no connection to you. Richard skimmed the papers, his face tightening. This proves nothing about who the donor was. Then read further. Nathan slid another document forward, the children's birth certificates. Father, anonymous donor. Mother, Emily Jenkins. Their legal status has never been in question, and I adopted them when they were 1. Every process followed to the letter. One of the lawyers objected. But their resemblance is deliberate, Nathan cut in. Emily selected donor traits that mirrored what she thought would make life easier for the children. Blue eyes, dark hair, Ivy League education, she chose echoes of you, not you. That was her right, her decision. Silence spread. Richard's gaze stayed locked on the adoption decree, the weight of it pressing down. For a long time, he said nothing. Then his voice cracked, quieter than Nathan had ever imagined from such a man. I saw myself in them. You saw what she chose, Nathan answered gently, and what you refused to be, a father. Richard's lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the futility. They gathered their papers, murmured about verifying documentation, but the fight was already bleeding out of the room. For the first time in decades, Richard's armor slipped. His empire, his pride, his lineage, all of it collapsed into a single aching truth. Emily had created a family without him, because he had left her no choice. When he finally rose to leave, his voice was hollow. I was wrong about her, about many things. Nathan didn't reply. He didn't need to. That night, Richard sat alone in his penthouse, staring at an old wedding photo of Emily, her smile filled with hope he had once destroyed. The triplets' faces haunted him, not because they were his, but because they never would be. 3 weeks later, Nathan received a letter. Inside was legal notice. Richard Thompson had withdrawn all inquiries. Attached was documentation of a $45 million endowment, half his fortune, placed into a trust for the Miller children's education, with one condition: they must never know its source. And so Richard vanished from their lives again. But this time, he left something behind, not a claim, not control, but a final, silent act of surrender. The conference room still smelled faintly of paper and coffee when Richard left it behind, his lawyers trailing in silence. Nathan remained seated, the adoption decree still spread open before him, its inked signatures more final than any gavel strike. He closed the folder slowly, his hands steady, though his heart thundered with a mixture of anger, grief, and relief. For a moment he imagined Emily beside him, her small, confident smile, the way she always told her students that rights weren't just arguments on paper, but choices in life. He whispered into the empty room, I kept them safe, Em, just like I promised. But Richard did not vanish into silence. He spiraled. In his penthouse overlooking the lake, he paced at night like a caged animal. The children's faces haunted him, replaying in his mind until he almost felt their small hands tugging at his sleeve. He told himself he had been wronged, that Emily had stolen his legacy, yet the documents were ironclad, her choices deliberate. Every fact undermined his fury. Still, his pride itched for a fight. The lawyers pressed him. We can still pursue DNA testing. The courts could be sympathetic given the resemblances. Richard almost agreed, almost signed the papers. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Emily in that Yale library, the woman who had once cleared a seat for him with reluctant kindness. He heard her voice the day she'd confronted him with test results he refused to read. The problem was never me. That memory gnawed at him. Meanwhile, Nathan returned home to 3 wide-eyed children waiting at the kitchen table. Alexander had tried to distract his siblings with a debate about dinosaurs, but Benjamin's restless foot-tapping betrayed his nerves, and Charlotte. He had drawn 3 figures holding hands under a sky full of tears. Dad? Alexander asked, his voice sharper, older than his 10 years. Who was that man at the funeral, the one who looked at us like he knew us? Nathan hesitated. He had promised Emily he would protect their children from Richard's shadow, but they deserved the truth, or at least part of it. He knelt beside them. That was someone from your mother's past. He thought he might have had a claim on you, but he doesn't. Because you are mine, and you are hers, always. Charlotte slipped her small hand into his. But he looked like us. Nathan's heart clenched. Sometimes strangers carry familiar features. What matters isn't who you look like, it's who stands beside you when you need them most. That night, after the children slept, Nathan sat in Emily's study, staring at the files she had left behind. He found himself whispering to her again, I hope I answered right. Across the city, Richard sat before his board of directors, but his thoughts wandered, numbers blurred, a merger victory tasted like ash. The empire he had fought for no longer seemed an empire at all. For the first time in decades, he questioned what it was all for. He began to make calls, not to lawyers, but to bankers, trustees, foundations. His assistants grew alarmed when he ordered half of his assets liquidated. When pressed, he told them only, I'm correcting a mistake. Weeks later, Nathan received a courier envelope. Inside was a formal notice. Richard Thompson had withdrawn every petition. Alongside it, a notarized document establishing a $45 million education trust for Alexander, Benjamin, and Charlotte. The stipulation was stark. The children must never be informed of the source. Nathan stared at the letter for a long time. Tucked at the back was something else. A handwritten note, folded once. Dr. Miller, I was wrong. About Emily. About family. About everything. I can't give back the years I stole from her, or the life I refused, but I can ensure those children, her children, never lack what I denied her. Please let this remain anonymous. They deserve a father, not a ghost. I forfeited that right long ago. Richard Thompson. Nathan closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. The bitterness he'd carried softened, not into forgiveness, but into something quieter. Pity, perhaps. Emily had once told him that Richard was brilliant but blind, a man who couldn't see beyond the horizon of his own ambition. Now, finally, that blindness had cracked open, but the story did not end there. That night, as Nathan locked the documents away in Emily's desk, he found a sealed envelope tucked into a back drawer, marked in her handwriting, "For Nathan, only if he ever comes back." His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a short letter, written years earlier in Emily's neat script. "If Richard ever learns the truth and chooses to help in silence, let him. Not for him, not for me, but for the children. Grace is sometimes the hardest justice. You'll know what to do." Nathan sat back, tears burning his eyes. Emily had anticipated everything, the fight, the resemblance, the temptation Richard might feel, and she had left her final instruction, to choose grace over anger, for the sake of their children. The next morning, when Alexander asked why he was smiling through his grief, Nathan kissed his forehead and said, "Because your mother was wise enough to plan for every tomorrow." And somewhere in the city, Richard signed away the last of his holdings, preparing to disappear, not to win, not to claim, but finally, to surrender. The spring wind off Lake Michigan carried the faint scent of lilacs through the Miller backyard, but for the family kneeling in the soil, the air was heavy with memory. Nathan guided Alexander's hands as the boy pressed earth around the roots of a young sapling. Beside them, Benjamin dug with relentless energy, dirt streaking his cheeks, while Charlotte carefully sprinkled water at the base of another tree, whispering something private, as if her mother could still hear her. "This one is for Mom," Charlotte said, her small voice solemn. "So she'll grow here with us." Nathan swallowed hard. The triplets had asked for a memorial garden themselves. He hadn't suggested it. He wasn't sure he could have spoken the idea aloud without breaking. Yet when Charlotte sketched it one afternoon, a circle of 3 trees around a flower bed in the shape of a heart, he knew Emily would have approved. And so they planted, hands working together in the soil she had loved, creating something new from the hollow where she once stood. As the children ran inside, Nathan lingered. He touched the sapling gently. "They'll be okay, Em. We'll be okay." But his voice wavered. Across the city, in a penthouse that glittered with emptiness, Richard Thompson closed the last leather-bound ledger of his empire. The numbers meant nothing now. For years he had measured his worth by these columns, profits, mergers, valuations, but the pages stared back at him hollow, mocking. His lawyers had fought to dissuade him, his board had begged him to reconsider, but Richard had been resolute. The firm would be sold, the estate liquidated. He packed a single box that night. Not the trappings of wealth, not the awards or the portraits, but a few books, a compass his grandfather once gave him, and a photograph of Emily on their wedding day. Her smile was soft, tentative, hopeful. He had destroyed that hope, and no amount of millions could restore it. The next morning, a jet carried him away from Chicago, away from the empire he once called his kingdom. His destination was a remote property in Alaska, a cabin perched on the edge of silence. The city would whisper about his retreat. Some would call it madness, others humility. Richard did not care. For the first time, he wasn't chasing a legacy. He was running from it. Back in Chicago, weeks turned into months. The triplets adjusted slowly to life without their mother. Alexander grew serious, pouring himself into school debates, his arguments sharp and logical, a faint echo of both his parents. Benjamin's curiosity exploded. He dismantled radios, built makeshift contraptions, and nearly set the toaster on fire, earning both scolding and laughter. Charlotte drew constantly, sketching her family, her mother, even dreams she couldn't explain. Each child carried grief differently, but each also carried pieces of Emily's resilience. One evening, as Nathan sifted through paperwork, a courier delivered another envelope. This one bore the seal of the trust. Inside was a quarterly statement of funds for the children's future, millions secured for their education, their lives. But beneath the papers was something more, a sealed side letter, addressed to Nathan only. He hesitated, then opened it. The letter was short, Emily's handwriting instantly recognizable. "If Richard ever learns, and if by some miracle he chooses grace instead of pride, let him help. Quietly, do not tell the children. Their love must never be divided. His money can serve them, but only your heart see. Hood guide them. Grace, Nathan, that is the justice I ask of you." Nathan pressed the letter to his chest. tears spilling freely. She had planned even this. She had known Richard might come, might fight, might falter. She had also known, somehow, that he might surrender. Years blurred into milestones. At 12, Alexander won his first debate tournament, his voice echoing across a crowded auditorium as he argued fiercely for constitutional privacy rights. Nathan sat in the front row, pride swelling in his chest. At 13, Benjamin unveiled a prototype science project that converted wasted kitchen heat into stored energy, teachers whispering he might change the world one day. At 14, Charlotte painted a mural on the side of their school, an explosion of color titled Ordinary Days, capturing scenes of laughter, love, and the quiet power of family. Each child thrived, not because of the fortune sealed away in trusts, not because of any ghostly benefactor, but because their mother had taught them resilience and their father, their real father, never stopped choosing them. One summer evening, the family gathered in the memorial garden. The trees had grown tall, their branches weaving together in the twilight. Charlotte lit 3 candles at their bases, and Alexander read a poem he had written, his voice steady. Benjamin tried to keep solemn, but ended up telling a story that made them all laugh until they cried. Nathan stood back, watching them, his chest aching with a blend of loss and joy. He thought of Richard then, alone in Alaska, a man who had once demanded an heir and ended with nothing but silence. He thought of Emily's letter, her insistence on grace, and for the first time Nathan understood. Legacy was not marble buildings or firm valuations. It was the echo of a mother's love, the resilience of children, the choice to love without condition. As fireflies dry, faded through the garden, Charlotte slipped her hand into Nathan's. She'd be proud, wouldn't she? Nathan's voice broke as he whispered, "She already is." Far away in the wilderness, Richard stared at the same stars, clutching the old photograph of Emily. For the first time in his life, he prayed not for power, not for wealth, but for forgiveness he would never hear. And in Chicago, beneath 3 growing trees, Emily's children laughed, cried, and lived. A living legacy that no empire could ever match.